Our final speaker for today is Jacob Levy, who will be delivering his third and final lecture for the seminar on a subject of pressing interest to us all, titled Black Liberty Matters. Professor Levy.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming on an evening to this talk. Well, I'm going to spend most of this talk in the United States. I want to start off at an older period of time. I'm going to start with ancient Rome and then move through some themes in early modernity before reaching the United States. In Justinian's Digest, which is one of the set of works that come down to us under the collective title of Justinian's Code, a compilation of the Roman law as that had evolved over some 1,000 years of the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. A document that was to go on to be almost certainly the most influential single document in the legal history of the West, because after it was recovered in the Middle Ages, it became the foundation for what goes on to be thought of as the civil law throughout continental Europe. In Justinian's Digest, the basic subject matter of ordinary private law is distinguished among the laws of people, things, and actions. It's the very first distinction governing the fundamental legal system that at the time had been the legal system of the whole known Mediterranean world for centuries and would go on to be the foundations of the legal system in Europe for centuries more. First distinction is people, persons, things, and actions. What's the second distinction? The second distinction starts off the law of peoples or the law of persons. And it's a distinction between free men and slaves. One of the most important starting points for thinking about law and the legal tradition in the West was the distinction between freedom and slavery. And this was a distinction of tremendous normative, ideological, political, what have you, importance to Romans. Because Romans had conceived themselves as having libertas, having the status of being free men. This was a central part of the self-conception of Romans from the time they established the Republic and expelled monarchs back around 500 BCE. Rome conceived as a society of libertas, a society of freedom, in a way that changed but did not disappear after the fall of the Republic, the advent of the empire. This wasn't, that is, just a simple technical matter of law. It's not an accident that it comes so close to the beginning. It's foundational. To be a Roman is to be a citizen bearing libertas, bearing freedom. And what is it to have freedom? It's not to be a slave. Now this, accompanied though it was just a moment later with a statement of the slavery institution contrary to nature, this was not an anti-slavery document or proclamation. It was an observed fact. Here's the key distinction. Some of us are free and some of us are slaves. And those of us who are free really tremendously value our freedom. We really tremendously value not being slaves. This is foundational to our political identity. The great historical sociologist Orlando Patterson argues that this has been a characteristic of societies that treated freedom or liberty as a central political value throughout history. That is, freedom is understood as a contrast concept to the observed reality of slavery. And while sometimes the value that is articulated by slaves or ex-slaves themselves to describe the good of being freed, the good of not being a slave, very often, it's a value that is articulated by the slave owners or the slave-owning class or population to describe what it is they value about being who they are and not those who they own. In Justinian's Digest, we see neatly summarized not only the understanding that liberty is to be understood as essentially opposed to the condition of slavery, but also the understanding that people can care very much about liberty while not aiming to free slaves, indeed, while taking for granted that part of the freedom they care about is their own freedom to own slaves and to be masters of slaves. To be a free man at Rome was partly to have the legal status that entitled you to be an owner of slaves, to be master of your household, very much including mastery of the slave within your household. This was so much a part of the Roman self-conception that they, without hesitation, espouse that the thought that they were a deeply free society and the thought that their society was founded on the opposition between being free and being slaves. And if Patterson is right, and I think that he is, this is a pattern that we should expect to see, if not quite so sharp articulated, over and over again. In early modernity, in an era when Eastern Europe, truly unfree labor, serfdom and slavery, had been abolished or had fallen into disuse within the actual metropolitan societies in France, in England, in the Netherlands, but was increasingly in use in the overseas empires of those countries. The rise and the return of slavery, combined with the gradual disappearance of serfdom, the kind of slavery that characterized medieval Europe, combined with the gradual disappearance of serfdom within Europe, became an object of considerable attention for the social and political and moral theorists of the era. Adam Smith, observing the difference between the European countries that had managed to abolish free labor within their and the increasing reliance on unfree labor, primarily and increasingly unfree people of African descent who had been brought in chains across the Atlantic Ocean in the Atlantic crossing to be enslaved labor in the Caribbean islands and in the American South primarily. Smith suggested that it would be extremely difficult to abolish slavery in any society in which the citizens, the free people, the people who had political standing, were relatively equal. That is to say, in a society that was relatively democratic. One of the things, and here Smith drew on some themes in Montesquieu, one of the things that allowed for the gradual disappearance of unfree labor in Europe was the steeply hierarchical and gradually sloping character of social status in a kingdom like France or England. The king stands above the great nobles, who stand above the lesser nobles, who stand above the gentry, who stand above the ordinary middle class, who stand above the tenant farmers, who stand above the laborers of the tenant farmers. And you can fill in lots more steps along the way. Whereas, in a society like those that were coming to exist in the plantation colonies in the Caribbean and in the Anglo-American colonies on the mainland, the 13 colonies, there wasn't a nobility. There wasn't the same gradual hierarchy above the status of what increasingly came to be explicitly understood as the status of being a white freeman. All of the white freemen, all of the white citizens were relatively equal because there's no nobility, there's no monarchy. In the absence of those gradual social gradations, political power would be dispersed among that population of free white people. The king in a society like France or England doesn't care very much about the relative standing of the second to lowest and the lowest classes in a society. The second to lowest classes care deeply. And to the degree that political power is dispersed, as it were, to the second lowest class, to the degree that political power is equalized, such that there are only two classes, freemen and slaves, the freemen care very much about that difference. And so whereas a king or a king in a House of Lords might abolish slavery, a democratic assembly made up of or elected by slave owners would almost certainly not. At the very least, Smith predicted, you would see slavery last much longer, much harder to extinguish in relatively equal societies, that is, relatively equal among the free people, than was the case in the monarchies of Europe. Now, this is important to note, is not an argument on Smith's part that slavery will be hard to abolish because it's profitable in the societies where it has taken hold. Indeed, Smith maintains that slavery would not be profitable. Slavery would always suffer actual economic imprisonment to employ free workers. However, Smith says, the love of domineering, our sheer desire for the status and power that we gain by being able to lord over another human being, that's an almost intractable part of our moral psychology. And people who love domineering and who are in a position to politically decide, will I give up the people over whom I dominate? They will answer no. The king doesn't have to do that. The nobility don't have to do that. They can still stand above the gentry and the middle class and so on. But the slave owners in a relatively democratic society, they only have one class of people over whom they can exercise their love of domineering, and they will not give it up. And so indeed, it proves to be. The British conservative Samuel Johnson, an opponent of the Americans in the War for Independence, was, for among other reasons, an opponent of the Americans because he thought the Americans were fighting a war to protect their slavery. How is it, he famously asked, that we hear the loudest yes for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Why is it these Americans are talking about liberty all the time? It did not dominate political discourse in a place like Britain or France, when, unlike Europeans in metropolitan Europe, the Americans in aggregate owned a great many slaves and relied to a very great degree on the slave labor of enslaved people of African descent. How is it, Johnson asked? Well, Smith, in a way, told us. It is precisely because they saw slavery, they saw what it was, that they really defined their political identity as being not that. And the Americans used language of slavery incessantly in their revolutionary dispute with Britain. What it was they charged the king and the Parliament of Britain with doing was with conspiring to make them slaves. That was the language of criticism. So the language of criticism that you find among people who know what slavery is because they practice it. The newly independent United States did not, as most of the founders expected it to, gradually over the course of a few decades, peacefully discontinue the use of enslaved labor. That was an almost universal expectation among the founding generation, and for technological, economic, but also political reasons, including a deep fear of slave revolt after the successful Haitian Revolution in 1803, didn't come to pass. Instead, in the states that had not abolished slavery, that is, say, in the American South and border states, slavery became much more deeply entrenched and much more ideologically celebrated than had been the case at the founding. In a way that corresponded over those decades with what was understood to be the increasing democratization of white society in the United States. In Jacksonian America, where even the poorest white man was the social equal of even the richest white man, at least in his imagination and in the political narrative someone like Andrew Jackson was telling them. That leveling of social status came at the price that there were no longer gradual gradations at the edges. Instead, social status became a plateau. All free whites, and then the people of no social standing whatsoever, that is, say, enslaved blacks. And this, for Jacksonian America, as for ancient Rome, was turned into an understanding of what it was I celebrate about myself when I say that I'm free. In the first place, I am free because I am not a slave. And in the second place, I am free in important part because I myself can own slaves. To be a free person was to be a person who was so incomparably higher in social status than those they enslaved that they could continue to hold them in slavery themselves. This, I want to suggest, is something that we're always going to find. Political theories and political systems that place a very high value on liberty. There was nothing in the Roman conception and nothing in the early American conception that demanded that liberty be accessible to all universally. Indeed, it was a premise of the system that it was not accessible to all universally. America could tell itself a story that it was the freest society in the world just because, and precisely to the degree that, Black liberty did not matter. The liberty that mattered was the liberty of those who were in the slave-owning race. Even if they were in the North, even if they were not themselves slave owners, they had the social standing that they were of the right kind of people who could own slaves. This became an enduring fact of political language and political ideas in the subsequent history of the United States. In the antebellum years, in the run-up to the Civil War, the Southern states would routinely use the language of liberty as a defense against what they feared as a federal encroachment on their traditional right to govern themselves as states and to own slaves and to establish slavery within their states. They would say both that they were the champions of decentralization or federalism, that is, government that is closer to home, and that they were the champions of the right to own property. And slaves were a tremendously economically valuable kind of property ownership in the antebellum United States. Now, the language of smaller or more close to home government and the language of the defense of property ownership, those are both languages that you're always going to find in defenses of liberty. What it is to be free is partly not to be governed by some faraway tyrant. We get to get together and decide for ourselves how things will go. And it's partly that what is mine cannot be taken by some alien agent like the state. This, of course, persisted into the years after the Civil War and the long ideological structure of Jim Crow. Over and over again, the ideologists of the lost cause, the celebrators of the Confederacy, and the architects of Jim Crow told a story about what it is to have a free society in which the liberty of the formerly enslaved people of African descent counted for nothing. A society was freer to the degree that the federal government couldn't tell the states what to do, that no one could come tell someone how to run the farm over which they were landlord, how to manage the workers who had been gradually re-coerced into being sharecroppers, which is an analogy to serfdom, a near match to the slavery that had been. Their understanding that they turned into a central pillar of American ideological discourse was that freedom was the freedom of the white class to stand incomparably higher in social status than those whom they had previously enslaved, and their freedom to go on continuing to dominate them. In the years just before the end of the Jim Crow system, at the height of the conflict that becomes the civil rights struggle, we see additional kinds of normative language enter into that pattern. For example, freedom of association. Freedom of association is a genuine good in a theory of freedom. I have the liberty to decide with whom I will associate, not only in my personal life, but also with whom I will associate out in my club memberships, out in my associations, in my businesses. There's a normal background presumption in a free society that mostly people don't have to spend time together if they don't want to, and that if I create an institution, a business, a club, an association, a school, I don't have to let people in whom I don't want to. That language of freedom of association became a central pillar of the defense against anti-discrimination law. And indeed, shifting the boundaries between public and private, such that a public school system under a desegregation order would overnight become a private school system, because then the private schools could assert freedom of association and therefore not be subject to the desegregation order. These became constant tools of the defense of Jim Crow and of American apartheid. Language of liberty throughout these decades was appropriated for the defense of domineering in a way that was distorting, but just in the same way that it had been distorting in Rome. It took no account of the value of freedom being equal. It took no account of the value, the tremendous increase in liberty that had come about with the abolition of slavery that would go on with the gradual elimination of Jim Crow and the racial supremacy states of the American South. For reasons having to do with ideological conflicts during the Cold War, to a certain degree, this was recast as a conflict between liberty and equality. The defenders of Jim Crow and apartheid maintained that they were defending liberty against an excess of equality, echoing the American struggle against communism and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It is, however, false. And when we don't understand that it's false, we not only misunderstand American politics, we misunderstand liberty. The liberation of slaves was a liberation. Juneteenth, which comes tomorrow, is the date of the celebration, the commemoration of the single greatest act of freeing in the history of the American Republic. It is only by not taking account of the liberty of Blacks that the contrary story was ever able to be told. The desire to recast the civil rights struggle as a struggle for equality against liberty became a source of distortion, not only in the self-understanding of America as a distinctively free society, but also in the lines of political conflict within the United States and in the self-understanding of those who thought of themselves as the heirs to a liberal or classical liberal intellectual tradition in the 20th century. Federalism, freedom of association, and property ownership are all of them genuine liberal values. And those who understood themselves as the heirs to liberalism in 20th century America could all too often be easily swayed by an appeal to limiting the power of the federal government, when what the federal government was proposing to do was to enforce the 14th Amendment's guarantee of the equal protection of the laws and to equal protection of life, liberty, and property, for all those subject to the laws of the states. That is, when the federal government proposed to defend the liberty of Black citizens against state governments. The defenders of Jim Crow would say, the federal government is the source of threats to liberty. There were people who believed it too quickly. This became a reason why those who self-consciously conceived of themselves as heirs to liberalism or heirs to classical liberalism were too often drawn, sometimes into an uneasy alliance, sometimes into an arms open alliance, and sometimes all the way into a kind of fusion with the defenders of deeply unjust systems of racial domination. Was the reason why, one of the reasons why, an act like the Federal Civil Rights Act, which, yes, abrogated freedom of association, but abrogated freedom of association precisely in the face of this kind of opportunistic shifting of public and private, and this constant use in the southern states of the threat of both public and private violence. That is, the local police and the local police authorizing private violence at night. The threat of private violence against anyone who engaged in race mixing. The pre-Civil Rights Act South was not a regime of free association. It was a regime of enforced racial segregation by state law and by effectively authorized private terroristic violence. The Civil Rights changed the balance of power between the federal government and the states, and changed the official balance between public and private at the federal level. Doing so in order to undo the kind of deep unfreedom that marked the white supremacies of the Jim Crow era. Now, not understanding how central liberty is to the civil rights struggle and the struggles since, or to put it another way, not understanding how central the liberty of Black Americans is and must be, the question of whether the United States is a free society has ongoing distorting effects to this day. The United States, the politicians of the United States, the defenders of American patriotism, say shockingly frequently that the United States is the freest nation on earth. This is such boilerplate verbiage that people don't even think of, it's simply taken for granted. The United States uniquely is conceived in liberty. The United States uniquely is dedicated to liberty as its animated idea. The United States imprisons more human beings than any other country in the world. It imprisons as a proportion of its population vastly more than any other country in the world. And by comparison with other countries that it understands to be its peers, constitutional democracies like the countries of Western Europe or Canada or Australia, New Zealand, not communist China, it's off the charts. How is the United States the freest nation in the world? The United States is the freest nation in the world because we don't take seriously the liberty of those who are thrown into cages. And that has been massively disproportionately since the era of mass incarceration arose, which is after the Civil Rights era. That has always been very disproportionately African Americans and as Hispanics. Mass incarceration, the war on drugs, which was one of the contributing factors, mass incarceration, though not the only one, the militarization of the police, and the increase steadily over decades, the sheer violence that police are authorized to present to the populations they govern. All of those in the United States are racial facts. Classical liberals and libertarians are very good at recognizing the facts that I've just described, recognizing that there is too much imprisonment, too much and too violent and too militarized of policing. we have not been nearly as good at recognizing that the reason for all of those features of American life, a reason why all of true in the United States in a way that's not true of peer societies, is deeply connected to this long history of actually devaluing Black liberty in the calculation of a free society. Indeed, in affirmatively valuing the possibility of whites exercising power over Blacks. There was an episode in Central Park that was very widely reported on a few in which a Black man told a white woman that she needed to have her dog on leash. The area was dedicated to bird protection. A dog off leash was a danger to birds. And the white woman, in order to reassert her power over the Black man in this exchange, called the police. Called the police, falsely claiming that there was a Black man trying to kill her. He fortunately video recorded the exchange, and so it was very clear that the exchange was nonviolent. The threat of violence was the threat of bringing the police. And she understood that this was a threat that would give her immediate power in the exchange. It would allow her to dominate because she could credibly threaten to bring the violence of the state to bear on this private interaction. The ability of whites to use the state at their back and to use the willingness of the state to abrogate Black liberty has been a constant feature in American history. And those who are concerned with increasing liberty, those who treat as one of their moral and political lodestars that ought to increase, have to take very seriously not only the long history of active state suppression of the liberty of African Americans, but also the entanglement of that with the social standing of white Americans. Their desire to have what the ancient Romans had, the status of libertas, a status that carried with the right to stand above and to exercise domination over the slaves in their midst. Thank you.
So our first question comes from Ben. How did the Declaration of Independence and its statement that all men are created equal relate to America's understanding of liberty and slavery?
It was a source of considerable complication, and the person of Thomas Jefferson became a source of considerable complication. The Declaration was eventually explicitly rejected by the Confederacy and by the defenders of American slavery. That all men are created was part of what was denied. This was relatively new in the history of slavery. The Romans didn't conceive of slaves as being a different race, didn't conceive of slaves as being naturally inferior. It says in Justinian that slavery is contrary to nature. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, as European thought in the Enlightenment and then American political thought in an age of increasing democratization came to think that all humans, or at least all men, were equal, and that entailed equal rights as a conclusion. That then required, if you're going to commit yourself to protecting slavery, that you start to deny the equality or indeed the humanity of those who are enslaved. And so over the course of the very late 18th and then first half of the 19th century, American slavery, it's not that it was racialized, it was only the case by the time of the Revolution that essentially no white people were held in indentured labor and that true slavery was reserved to Africans. But that slavery came to be justified by a racist ideology. A story was told that Africans weren't fully human beings. Because if they were, then they would be entitled to the full legal equality that the Declaration had promised them. And so while one strategy for the defenders of slavery was simply to deny it, another was to say, yes, all men are created equal, and those there aren't really men. Insisting on the equality and equality of rights, again, has this way of sharpening the divide between those who have rights and those who don't. And it requires a new language of justification. And that racialization, that development ideology of racial inferiority, became one of the ways that American slavery persisted in what are referred to as badges and into slavery long after formal abolition. Jefferson himself, well known and self-celebrating as the author of the Declaration, was unfortunately one of the key contributors to the development of this theory of scientific racism. He conceived of himself as being a kind of Enlightenment scientist who was very interested in the questions of different organisms, different kinds of biological entities, and their relevance or otherwise. And he was deeply psychologically conflicted about his own relationship to slavery, almost certainly about his own relationship to actual slaves, and about the relationship between the slavery that he maintained in his household and the political ideals that he espoused. And so, on the state of Virginia, he put pen to paper as the leading intellectual, the leading scientific intellectual of the new republic, and speculated at great length about the possible intrinsic inferiority of Africans. That meant the Declaration's legacy was not unambiguous. Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address tried to turn the language of the Declaration into being a cornerstone of a non-slave free American republic. But that was an act of reappropriation and recreation on Lincoln's part. The Declaration was not unambiguously that in the previous decades.
How does the freedom to dominate Black Americans that you've discussed relate to the forcible relocation and oppression of the native peoples of the Americas?
In moral magnitude, in its way, I think it's right to treat slavery and the enslavement of people of African descent and the mass expropriation and mass murder of Native Americans as being on a par. But they're really very different in their relationship to the ongoing workings of the political order at any given time. Native Americans weren't included. They were on the outside, and they were steadily kept on the outside, both by their own desire not to be assimilated and by sheer fact of being constantly physically removed and pushed away. At the frontier, it mattered for relations between an individual white person and an individual Indian that the white person in principle might have access to the resources of the state. In principle, might be able to call in sheriffs or marshals of the US Army. But those forces were typically pretty distant. A white person's freedom at the frontier was built on the fact that Indians had already been expelled and expropriated, not based on the ability to personally dominate Indians. Indeed, they normally wished not to have actual Indians around very much anymore at all. There's very much a racial substructure to both kinds of liberty, but the liberty at the frontier, the liberty with respect to Indians, wasn't a liberty of dominating actual human beings in front of them. Rather, it was simply resting on the structure of already having taken their land and expelled them from it.
When it comes to fighting institutional racism, how much do we need social norms to change? And how much do we need to actually seek changes in the law itself?
I'm going to have no idea how to answer this beyond a very hand-waving, lots of both, very lots. Lots of both is required. Social norms, though, need to be understood as norms about, among other things, how we approach political institutions. I am very skeptical of approaches to racism that so disregard the structural and institutional features of it that they become obsessed with, as it were, the state of the soul of the individual white person. Our question about racism is not, is this white person a racist in their soul? It's what actions have been taken, both at an individual level and at an institutional level. And there's some things in the discourse around overcoming racism or anti-racism that can sometimes kind of recreate this individual sin conception, treating personal reformation as if it's the same as norm change. And personal reformation isn't the same as norm change. Norms are social facts. And changing them isn't a matter just of self-criticism or of interpersonal conflict. It's a matter of re-articulating what norms govern a whole social order.
Could you talk a little bit about your views on what this argument would say for the needs for something like reparations?
This argument by itself doesn't do that. And I think that one could take on board everything that I've said here and still come out either way on questions of reparations, understood as a matter of rectifying historical injustice. However, the entanglement of the American state with the question of Black liberty didn't end in 1865, and it didn't persist only at the state level through 1964. Appropriation of Black labor and Black resources was an ongoing fact throughout the 20th century. A great deal of the wealth of the American middle class was developed over the course of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s through such mechanisms as the GI and federal housing guarantees, the Federal Housing Authority, all of which ran through segregated institutions. Those acts weren't discriminatory formally at the federal level. However, the Federal Housing Authority very clearly developed guidelines about what mortgages were good to guarantee and what mortgages weren't that included redlining. This was a tremendous redistribution from Black America to white America within living memory. And I think that taking that seriously, understanding how thoroughly the American state was committed for how long to an active redistribution of wealth from Black to white, it makes the case for reparations stronger. And it makes it harder to argue against reparations on the simple grounds that too much time has passed. Because we shouldn't think as the relevant time 1865. We should understand that living people grew up in households that were impoverished by decisions of the states and the federal government. And that there's a case for reparations to be made through understanding that structure of racism, that structure of state racism and state enforced racism, continuing until quite recently, and as an act of redistribution against which there is some claim of justice to have it undone.
This is a slightly broader question that then gets to something on topic. How is power conceptualized in classical liberalism? And how does that conception relate to how classical liberals think about policing currently in the US?
I will say it's often been the case, but it doesn't have to be the case, that classical liberal political thought has conceived of power strictly through the language of coercion. And that obscures some facts about standing and status and domination. I'm struggling a little bit here. I'm trying to make the jump from that to talking about the liberal tradition as a whole.
It's a broad question.
Yeah, say the second part again so I can try to.
So the second part was how might that classical liberal view of power with the connections to domination, sort of thing, how might that inform our view today on current policing practices?
On policing practice. So while I do think that the emphasis on coercion is often too narrow, we don't really need to broaden it very much in order to get a very clear understanding of the power imbalances at work in contemporary practices of policing. It's one of the strange things about the ideological discourse around policing and imprisonment in the United States. You don't need complicated theories of freedom in order to say that people who are imprisoned are unfree, and that imprisoning more people to mean there's less freedom in the society. Nor do you need a complicated theory of power and freedom to say that armed police facing unarmed protesters have a power imbalance there. There are other parts of structures of racism that will call for more subtle and more complicated diagnoses of power. The question that's going to be one that's hard for classical liberals sometimes to struggle with is how to conceive of simple wealth inequality with relationship to power, and whether we can take seriously a society of equal people against the background of some kinds of wealth inequality. That's a hard question for classical liberals. But the question, police have too much power, do prison guards have too much power? Those, I think, should be easy ones. And to the degree that they're not, it's a sign of whose liberty is being counted, not a sign of having an insufficiently subtle theory of power and liberty.
How should we understand liberty in a way that moves past the idea that libertas is a status?
So here, I have kind of idiosyncratic views about the relationship between the civic republican tradition that dates to Rome and that was reappropriated in early modernity as a language of political liberty, and the liberalism that emerged to some degree out of it, but to some degree in opposition to it in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And this is very complicated in the United States because rhetorical appeals to the founding, which are very much part of American political discourse, and especially political discourse about liberty, will often be conducted in terms of the founders' attachment to older ideas that we would now call Republican as distinct from liberal. I think that the Republican tradition is a tradition of liberty as standing and status. And the liberal tradition is potentially only partly that. I don't think we can do away with it altogether. I think it's important to maintain the idea that there's such a thing as a fundamentally legally free person. But to the degree that we come to think of liberty in a broader way as freedom from lots of kinds of power, freedom, the kind of freedom that we encounter, for example, in the marketplace or in the plurality of religions that characterize modern societies, and the United States in particular, a freedom of choice, a freedom that becomes possible only against the background of a relatively rich and complicated social order. Then freedom isn't only the declaration of a legal standing. Freedom isn't like a passport that you carry around. And one could simply talk about people becoming freer, even as they're losing their relative status over those unfree people against whom they'd previously defined themselves. That's under-theorized. Those are, that's not anything that I've committed to print yet, anything that I've fully worked out an argument for. But I do think there's something in the transition from republicanism to liberalism that holds the potential for providing the status-oriented conception of libertas.
So we have a couple questions about the state of American founding documents related to current Black liberty. So on the one hand, are there discussions in the Federalist Papers or other foundational documents that draw on things like the Justinian Code to justify this sort of oppression? So that might be the negative side of the question. The positive side of the question is, do you think that some of those same founding documents, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, can be invoked today by protesters, by those fighting for liberty, as a guiding source for greater equality?
So the first is easy. There are no affirmative defenses of slavery to be found in the Federalist Papers. There is no affirmative defense of slavery to be found in the Constitution. And there are a few affirmative defenses to be found, affirmative defense of slavery to be found in the political thought of any of the intellectually interesting parts of the founding generation. As I said, it was widely expected that slavery would disappear as a matter of historical transformation within 1 or 2 generations. Constitution doesn't mention slavery. When it has to say something about the institution, it talks around it. In the famous 3/5 compromise, representation is allocated on the basis of a full proportion of free persons and 3/5 of the other population of the state. Slavery is not named. In the Federalist Papers, when Madison has to kind of defend the 3/5 compromise because he's committed himself to defending the whole Constitution in the Federalist Papers, even those parts that he was not happy with within the convention. There again, he talks around it, and he's perfectly open about doing so. He shifts the voice of the narrator to, well, if one had to defend this, one could come up with something like this, or you could imagine someone saying something like this. There's a deep discomfort with confronting the contradiction between slavery and the ideals that are being espoused. The same kind of tension that Jefferson is working through. But that also means there's no forthright condemnation of it. That ambiguity sits around waiting to be exploited come the rise of scientific racism and come the real resurgence of and intensification of slavery after the 1790s. I do think that the Constitution is clearly available as a resource for the defense of liberty of protesters. It's clearly an available resource for defense of liberty against over-policing and violent policing and lawlessness. The Bill of Rights is there and the 14th Amendment is there to do all of that kind of work. Whether the Constitution is an available resource for anti-racism as such, well, this was something that the abolitionists disagreed about before the Civil War. It was something that sometimes abolitionists changed their mind about. But it was a harder case to make in the affirmative before the Reconstruction Amendments. If we take seriously the Reconstruction Amendments as a real transformation in the American constitutional order, and I think that we must, if we take seriously the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, name a new pillar of the American Constitution. Not only abolishing slavery, but undoing slavery and resisting its ongoing legacy. Ensuring the right of political participation and the equal protection of the laws to those who were enslaved and their descendants. Then that becomes an absolutely vital normative political resource in contemporary civil rights struggles to this day. Treating 14th and 15th Amendments as being alive, not dead, is a crucial part of current legal, constitutional, and political struggles about the free and equal standing of Black citizens. But that's not reliance on the founding Constitution. That's reliance on the amended Constitution.
Okay, so we have two questions left, and we have just enough time to cover those. And I've saved these for last just because I know that these are among your favorite thinkers. So first, could you explain how Montesquieu's argument against slavery might relate to this discussion of Black liberty? And secondly, what might Judith Shklar's work have to say for the current struggles that we have against cruelty and harm?
Not only two of my favorite thinkers, but thinkers with a strong connection. Shklar was deeply influenced by Montesquieu, and indeed was my introduction to Montesquieu. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, brutally mocked racialized justifications of slavery as those were starting to be articulated. And even as venomous a critic of Montesquieu as Voltaire, praised The Spirit of the Laws precisely for offering such a brutal indictment of slavery. And precisely what Montesquieu did was to, in the voice of some imagined defenders of slavery, say, well, it must be the case that having lips of that shape, or ears of that shape, or skin of that texture, these must be things of tremendous moral importance. These must make for an utterly different race of humans. Because if they didn't, then we would have to confront the fact that Europeans are raiding the shores of Africa to enslave human beings. And then how could we Europeans continue to think of ourselves as Christians or indeed as fully moral human beings at all? That the equality of creation implied an equal claim to freedom. That's what's running through that chapter of The Spirit of the Laws. It has to be the case that the slaves that Africans aren't fully human, or else this slavery is radically unjust. And look how dumb the claims are for African not being fully human. It therefore follows that we are absolutely morally prohibited from doing what Europeans are doing to Africans. It is, I think, one of the earliest statements of that thought, that if we take moral equality seriously, we must oppose slavery as an institution. Shklar's book, American Citizenship, is far too little read, and I want to encourage everyone to go read it. American Citizenship is a work about, in large part, what it is to live after the Civil War, what it is to live with the Reconstruction Amendments, what it would mean to take those seriously, and what it is that Black Americans have struggled for in their struggles for freedom. They sought, Shklar maintains, among other things, but really centrally, the right to work and the right to vote. Now, Shklar has a famous line in The Liberalism of Fear in which she says liberalism is permanently monogamously married to democracy, but is only a marriage of convenience. Liberalism, which is Shklar's central concern, isn't really about democratic practice. It's not really about democratic government. It's really about our freedom from government. But, she says, what it is these freed slaves sought to confirm their standing as no longer slaves was, almost more importantly than anything else, the vote. This put democracy into a more central place than was true in just the theory that you find in The Liberalism of Fear, because in fact, the struggle between Blacks and those who sought to oppress them was importantly a struggle about access to the ballot box. That remains true to this day. And Shklar's American Citizenship, though it's now more than 30 years old, I think, is absolutely timely for the struggles that we are seeing right now, not chiefly the struggles against policing. Those, again, we could talk about just in the language of the fear and the resistance to state violence and state cruelty of the sort that police and prison guards are empowered to exercise. But an understanding of what full equal citizenship for Blacks would be, and how much that relies on free, open, fair access to the ballots and to free and fair elections. That's very much a matter of struggle right now. And I think Schlar's American Citizenship can help teach people who are Schlarian in their orientation, thinking that liberalism is more important than democracy, to understand that liberalism in this society, this history, must also be robustly democratic.